and one or more of those collective voices say, we need to come together to address this issue. The idea of that collective effort, okay, the idea of that collective effort to address or advocate for change around either a social injustice or an economic injustice or a political injustice is what I would call a social movement. Okay, as long as there is collective effort, as long as there is a collective issue that the collective effort seeks to address, then you have the beginning, or you have a social movement begin to take shape. And so for me, a social movement is that. And when we look at a social movement, or when we look at a movement, so basically a movement is any collective effort coming in to address an injustice. And when you look at such efforts, at times, and maybe this is a question that I may be preempting, but there are times that people think a social movement has to be, it has to be a mono idea or a mono direction. And in terms of direction, maybe yes, that we all agree on a specific issue, but the fabric of a social movement, the composition of a social movement is diverse in nature. And that is why it's called a social movement. That even if, for example, gender-based violence is something that we are all concerned about, how we contribute to it can be very diverse. How FIDA addresses issues of gender-based violence may not be the same as how another organization or another individual might choose to address issues of gender-based violence, although all of them might agree that gender-based violence is an issue that needs to be addressed. And so when we talk about social movements and movement building, which you talked about, and maybe before I go to the last section of that question, movement building is basically, in my opinion, the continuous efforts that we put in to ensure that there's continuous progress, or there is continuous work or effort being made by this collective group to ensure that the injustice that has been identified is addressed. And so when we look at movement building, one of my profound classes in movement building likens movement building to a train. And in that likelihood, it said that for every train, and in this particular instance, the train will be the movement, okay, the social movement that we are building. In every train, there's a beginning and there is a seeming end, which means that the train must leave the station for work around the movement to begin. And the journey of the train then becomes your movement building. But even as the train moves, there are characteristics of any train, or even in this instance, we could talk about a taxi, a taxi or a bus, or, there are characteristics of people in there, that in this train, there are people who are awake. And so in every movement, there are people who are awake and are conscious of what is happening on the train. But on the same bus or train, you have people who are sleeping. And so even in this movement, even in a movement around gender-based violence, there will be people who are sleeping. On any train, for people who have traveled, especially up country, there's that random doctor who is, like, for us, we are traveling, but this random doctor is on this train and he's selling this drug that treats every disease. He says it will treat backache, impotence, infertility. You get? So on every train, just like even movement building, there are distractors. And so even when we talk about building a movement, we must be aware that there are distractors. On every train, there are train stops. So if, for example, you're going to Soroti, there are people who will get off in Jinja, there are people who will get off in Numbari, there are people who will get off in Kumi, and there is no crime. And so even with a social movement, I know that there are times that people take offense when some members of the movement either take a back seat or leave. But you see, leaving is normal, because just like at every stop people leave, there are people who will come onto the train. And so the idea around movement building is how are we preparing for exits for people who get off the train? How are we preparing for entries for people who get onto the train at different levels? And in the train, there is a diversity of skill. You have people who are teachers. When you look at someone like Dr. Sylvia Tamale and you bring her to any conversation, she will teach and everyone will understand. And there are people on the train, if you called them to teach, they would confuse everyone. On the train, there are people who theorize for us. There are people who provide much needed self care. There are people who provide ears. So the train has a diversity of skill. It also has a diversity of get off and get on locations. It also has a diversity of people, all of whom are doing very different, unique things. But at the end of the day, that train is moving. And that's my overview really of movement building. Over to you, Elizabeth.
Thank you so much, Isabella, for giving that sort of backdrop on what social movements are, because I'm sure we have individuals on this call, either individual lawyers or members in private practice, that may not have interfaced with what social movements or movement building looks like. I'd like to appreciate one of the things that you said about it being a group of people, you're moving together, there's a common goal, there's things you've kept on making reference to, there's a common goal, there's something that you're both, that you're all working towards. You kept on emphasizing the movement, like the fact that there's things that are going to work out together, there's those that are going to drop off. But one of the many things that you've kept on emphasizing is that common goal that you're all working towards. So thank you very much, Isabella. So to get into the more technical parts of the conversation, would like to hear from you on an overview of what the current state of women's rights and gender equality in Uganda looks like. And why this is important for this conversation is because for us at FIDA, we are currently experiencing or enjoying the privilege, in quote unquote, of organizing, of supporting social movements in select districts, like I said earlier on, through the We Cannot Wait coalition, through which we are intending to build diverse, intersectional social movements of women who are able to hold government accountable, who are able to organize around responding to different issues, to bring other issues on the forefront. So it's important for us to sort of have that context, and I think you did mention it. So, what is the current state of women's rights and gender equality? And maybe it would be important for you to just string the current state to why social movements are even necessary right now at this moment because of that particular context.
Thank you very much, Beth. And as I answer that question, I think it's important that we remember that social movements have a lifespan, just like any individual. We are born, we live, yeah, you die. Okay. And so even with social movements, there is a trajectory. Social movements will be born, social movements will live, they will thrive. But there are social movements that die, and they may die because they have come to the end of their lifespan, or they may die because there's been a change in general direction, or they will die because the context does no longer favors um, the, the nature in which they exist. And so at the point of death, there's also the option for social movements to re-emerge, okay, or re-strategize and rebrand and come back different. And so when you talk about the current state of women's rights, I think towards the onset of 1995, there were quite a number of gains, okay? And the culmination of those gains around 1995 was the 1995 Constitution. And after 1995, we began to see again a couple of successes. I think after 1995, we had the first woman army commander um, in Uganda. After 1995, we had the first female speaker. So there's been progress. So the context is that there has been progress. And this is important because when I was responding to your past question, I mentioned that whatever is happening, the train will continue moving. there has to be a very significant thing that causes the train to stop. So whether there is a random man selling medicine, whether there is a person having a heart attack, whether there is a woman giving birth, the train will continue to move until the next stop. And so the one thing to know is that when we look at the state of women's rights and gender equality, it has continued to progress because of the law of growth. There has been growth. There has been continued investment by civil society organizations like FIDA. You have had an entry into women's legal aid entities like the Women's Pro Bono Initiative. You have had more organizations paying attention to the very important work around providing legal services to women. So there has been progress. When you look at the country, the establishment post 1995, the establishment of the Equal Opportunities Commission, the provision of the certificate for gender equity, there has been progress. When you look at post 1995, even to now, when we are having this call, we have a second female speaker in parliament. Again, the train is moving, irrespective of what is happening. There is a train. So you have a woman heading parliament. You have our first female prime minister. You have um, our vice president, who is a woman. So you have, there is seeming progress for women's rights and gender equality when you look at it. That notwithstanding, even if the train is moving, there, for lack of a better word, has been a fair share of chaos inside the train. And the fair share of chaos has been chaos that has disrupted the fabric, the internal fabric of the train. Because like I said, the train will continue to move. The question is at what speed is it moving, but also how much disruption is happening inside there. And so when we talk about chaos inside the train, when we talk about chaos um, inside this movement of women's rights and gender equality in Uganda, there, I think one of the things that has a very profound effect on how we are on the journey and progress, especially within the legal sphere, is the relationship between the different actors within the movement. Because like I said earlier also, the movement is different actors recognizing an injustice. In the past, I remember we shared, and yes, I very believe we shared we shared a very intimate relationship, for example, as civil society, the political and government. And there were a lot of successes that were won in there. The relationship that civil society, for example, shared, um, and this is a safe space. So yes, and I hope that this doesn't get onto Twitter because of the situation that we're already in right now as a country. But the relationship that civil society, for example, women civil society shared with a person like Rebecca Kadaga at that time and the chairperson of WOPA at that time gave birth to a lot of tranquility, but also a lot of progress within the women's movement. Today, if we were to count the number of engagements that women in our broadness have held with any of the offices of the top leaders, they're very countable, or for lack of a better word, non-existent. The efforts that we see are individual, might be individual efforts here and there, but to say that there's been collective action, I think that is something that we have lost, and that is something that has affected how we mobilize, especially around our legislative agenda. When we look at the relationship that that organizations, the women's rights organizations share with an entity like UOPA. I don't think that we've ever had such a a tumultuous relationship as we do today. And I say tumultuous because when we look at some of the regressive laws that are being introduced that affect women's right to choose, that affect women's right to exist as women, those particular laws are being pushed by the same entity that we would, under normal circumstances, be running to for redress. When you look at the criminalization of sex work, um, when you look at some of the very unfortunate statements that have been made around the marriage bill, when you look at the unfortunate statements that have been made
Hey, hey,
around
next it.
around the discussions on IVF, when you like,
No, not
oh,
next.
and the thing is, at the center of all that is an office
There is.
that
They've just
previously
started putting them there.
supported a lot of the efforts in the movement. And so right now, when I look at context, it is to say that there's still very important work that is being done by different actors, but the efforts um the efforts are in their own corners. Everyone is in their own courage and saying my courage will deliver the train. Unfortunately, an individual courage can't deliver the train. The train needs everyone on board to be able to move. And so and I think I will go. I'm already running to one of the questions that you'll ask later. So what do we do? One of the things that we need to do is to revisit collective effort. I think we've done it a little bit well as a sector, as civil society, but we need to go back to collective effort between civil society, professional bodies like ULS and others, but also collective efforts with government institutions if we are to continue to advance in the direction that we wish to go, the aspect of women's rights and gender equality in Uganda. Over to you, Elizabeth.
Thank you so much, Isabella, for giving that broad overview. I think what I hear is that social movements comprise really of different actors, including individuals and informal groups that are pushing for different things or that congregate through either joint social causes or actions or social actions that you kept social actioning that you kept on referencing. I'd like to just mention that social movements or movement building on different or particular issues is not, like Isabella's mentioned, is not a new subject for us here in Uganda or for us here in Africa as feminists, as women's rights organizations that are pushing back, negotiating, working with, collaborating with the government on achieving gender equality and equity in Africa. When you do remember the mobilization around against apartheid in South Africa, when you look at the campaign against the blood diamonds in Sierra Leone, for Ugandan context, when you do remember Women's Lives Matter for us here in Uganda, in the more recent one in Kenya that led to the Women's March, when you do remember the one in Benin or social movements in Benin around accountability on social justice, all those movements, we continue to see something that is similar, that particular groups that feel that there's an injustice or particular groups that are affected by a particular injustice are coming together to respond, to negotiate, to push back. And I think that's one of the things that makes social movements so necessary, that there's a whole lot of people investing in doing a whole lot of things in a more organized manner, in responding, in negotiating, and all these things that Isabella keeps speaking about. So thank you so much, Isabella, for your response to that question. I'll get to our next question, which is, for you, what do you see as some of the most effective strategies or tactics that have been employed in the women's movement here in Uganda to advance women's rights or to promote gender equality and equity? And what are some of those, for you, examples, either that you've been part of or organizations that you've been part of have pushed and have had significant impact on organizing of women's rights?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Elizabeth. I think one of them, one of the most profound
You take because now
for me was
all these people put them there.
was the were the collective efforts towards the establishment of the Equal Opportunities Commission, and we can have a conversation around um, whether
This meeting.
the EOC has delivered what it should have delivered. But I think that was very profound.
We are
Also,
six.
like I had mentioned earlier, was the introduction of the certificate for gender equity that every budget in Uganda must pass before it is approved by Parliament. And what that gave us was a very committed
Like people used to do
um, a very committed collective effort in government to ensure that the budgets that are provided have aspects or meet the minimum standards
create a poll.
around ensuring that they address issues of gender equality. So for me, those two were quite profound for me. The other one that I could talk about
Which meeting platform?
is efforts, and this may not necessarily be by everyone, but it's happened. I know that there's been efforts by entities that work on issues of domestic violence to engage with cultural leaders. Okay, and so when a kingdom like Buganda comes out and speaks out on issues of HIV, when they speak out on issues of domestic violence, it's not something that comes out of nowhere. When the king of Alur Kingdom
That is the if that African
comes up and begins to encourage his subjects
that's
to keep girls in school and to treat women better, and their actual efforts by the Alur government,
we are
those
on
are not efforts that the king dreamt up overnight. I know that in districts
I
like
have to use
Nebi, Pakwach, Greater West Nile, I know that FIDA works there. I also know that MEMPRO works there, and those are two institutions, for example, that have done quite a bit of work, especially in addressing issues of negative cultural norms and ensuring that communities are transformed. Another another effective strategy that has been employed to advance gender equality, and I was just reminded of it when I saw Eunice join the call, is efforts by entities like Akina Mama to provide feminist analysis to the work that we do. So I know that Akina has done a feminist analysis on taxation. It has done a couple of analyses, and those have gone a long way in one, building knowledge, but also pointing fingers to where the problem is. Another strategy that has been employed is the strategy of decentralization. And I know that government talks about decentralized, but I think civil society has decentralized better. The move of work from Kampala, from the center, and the center has its own unique challenges, but the continued investment to push work away from the center into communities that actually need it the most is an effective strategy that we have been able that we've been able to employ. The other one is the back the very important um, behind the scenes work that goes into making sure that women are at the forefront. I remember, and that is very collective, and it's very strategic, and it's very planned. I remember when Geraldine Sally was having issues at NSSF, there was a collective effort to just say, how are we separating the issues of Geraldine Sally and the attack on her as a woman. And such efforts have gone a long way, in protecting or in consolidating the presence of women and promoting gender equality. When you look at efforts around, okay, so we had Geraldine Sally, Okay, the names have now disappeared. But we know that no, we know that a couple of us belong to some women's groups, and when it comes to issues of women standing for political office, I know that on a couple of occasions, women have come up and have said, we are going to support women who are going to stand for elections. But the question is, what is their agenda? And support has been provided to women who have pledged to commit work and time towards the advancement of women's rights once they get into office. And that has been at parliament level, at district level, at council level. And I believe that those are very effective strategies that we may not tell the story about very effectively every day, but they are making all the difference. And yeah, I think I'll stop there and hand back over to you.
Thank you so much, Isabella, for sort of spotlighting what some of those strategies or tactics have been that have been employed by different activists, by different women's leaders in advancing women's rights and gender equality and equity here in Uganda, and some of the examples really that you share on how women's movements have supported individual women, either in terms of political participation or leadership at different institutions of the government. In your opinion, what are some of the primary challenges that women's rights activists and organizations in Uganda, and I know these are really several, right? Because I know for many of us, the women on this call, either you're here as an activist, that is part of an NGO, a CBO, or any other organizing, like we mentioned earlier. So, what for you do you see as primary challenges, and how do factors such as cultural norms, the legal framework within which we are operating, the political dynamic right now in Uganda, without even delving into the details of it, how is it impacting organizing or movement building around promotion of women's rights?
Okay, so thank you very much. Thank you very much, Elizabeth. The political dynamic has multiple faces, and I think I talked about one of the faces, which is how we as activists and organizations are engaging with other arms of government. I remember a particular instance where, and without being quoted, one of the heads of the arms said the problem with you educated women is that you think a lot and it's very difficult to work with you. Also, you don't respect me. You get. And so I listened to this rant and I was like, okay, so this is what a head of an entire unit thinks about women in civil society. And you see, mindsets like that, statements like that go a long way in determining how such individuals then engage with us, either as organizations or as individual activists, because an opinion has already been formed, and by default that affects organizing, because if we are to call upon some of the women in these offices as allies, then you're not sure they are showing up because of this opinion. But also, when you talk about political dynamics, it's to say that in a country like ours, which has been heavily militarized, at the end of the day, the effects of this militarism will trickle down to women being adversely affected. So when you look at the political dynamics, for example, look at the lady, the Noop lady, her name evades my head, but she's been held without any particular reason, and she is a political activist. And remember, with social movements, there are hues of connectivity that everyone is working towards a common goal. But if you hold her like that without any particular reason, the question is, how is that affecting how women show up at the table? Does that then mean that you have more more yes personalities sitting at the table with who are not necessarily pushing the gender equality card? And I think we've already begun to see it. We have asked questions around the marriage bill And up to today, we have not received very clear responses to that. We've had very disturbing statements being made by UOPA, and efforts. I don't know whether there's any organization that has been able to get very clear responses on on some of the legislation, some of the problematic legislation that UOPA is pushing, despite the fact that the head of UOPA was able to get leave of absence to work on these bills. And so that definitely affects our efforts to promote gender equality, especially because this is an office, but also it's an individual that we have worked with very successfully in the past. When we talk about cultural norms, I think I talked a little bit about the Alur community, and to say that um, where you have culture. So, for example, one of the things that I learned when I visited the Alur community was that they have their marriage ceremonies take more than 2 days. I think they take about 5 or 7 days. And it's at those ceremonies that girls are sexually violated the most. And so after a ceremony like that, you begin to notice the school dropouts, you begin to notice um, the number of rape cases that have gone up. And until the kingdom came in and put out a declaration that cultural ceremonies should only take 1 day, there was still a very big problem. And so today, people are adhering to the king's statement. But at the end of the day, when we look at actions like that, they definitely affect efforts to promote gender equality, because it means that that FIDA is going to have to continuously, year in, year out, have to look for resources, both human and financial, to address issues of sexual violence, not because of anything, but parties that are happening, and those parties could be regulated. But also, when you look at cultural norms affect our thinking. They affect how we view women. And I think one of the most interesting ones was at the Nabagereka's book launch, which I will not go into, but I will just hint a little bit on a lot of the comments that came in as a result of some of the revelations in her book. And the question I kept having was, okay, in her capacity, you know, what do some of these statements mean for our struggle for gender equality? You know, but also it was great to know that she was courageous enough to say, no, I'm going to tell my truth, I'm going to tell my story. And her telling her story also had an implication on the work that we do, because then therein we found an ally. And so when we look at the cultural norms, they're still very much alive amongst us. When we look at the political dynamics, they're still very much alive around us. When we look at the security situation in our country, it is very much alive, because in a country where illegal detainment um, of people continues, in a country where you will be arrested and there will be no clear charge on your charge sheet, that affects how how we show up, for gender equality. It affects how you push back, because when we look at movement building, there are instances in there that negotiations may need to be put on hold. And when negotiations are put on hold, activism will take the center stage. But the question is, how many women on this call would happily show up, maybe for a march tomorrow to parliament, well knowing that between FIDA maybe in Intinda and parliament, half of you may be collected and we will never know where you are. So right now, the struggle to promote gender equality has almost become a struggle of the privileged, the ones who are sure that if they got arrested, there will be someone to either write an article, or there will be a pro bono lawyer to show up, or there will be communal efforts to show up. And if you're not sure about that, then you no longer have the privilege of taking part in activism or taking part in effort to promote gender equality that may rock the power boat. And the power boat is a real dynamic for us today. Over to you, Elizabeth.
Thank you very much, Isabella, for highlighting some of those challenges. And as you are speaking, I was reminded about an event that we did have towards Women's Day with other members of the We Cannot Wait Consortium. Maybe just to mention that the We Cannot Wait Consortium is a collective of women's rights organizations or feminist organizations that are working towards an inclusive and diverse women's movement in the Greater Horn of Africa. And it's a program that is being implemented across 5 countries in of the Greater Horn of Africa, including Uganda, which is FIDA, ourselves that are hosting this session today morning, South Sudan, Sudan, Ethiopia, and Somalia. And a lot of the work that we are doing in there, or a lot of the work that we were speaking about during that session, was on investment or the viability of investment in social movements, right? And it's something that you've spoken about, or that I'd like to also take a minute to highlight in terms of challenges that are experienced in social movements, to say that money money is one of the big challenges that we see that social movements do excuse me, that social movements do experience. We know that our investment in women's rights movements, for example, here as FIDA, is informed by the fact that movements are pushing and creating sustainability, which is really the intention of this session, for us to sort of explore what sustainability of social movements looks like for those that have done it, for those that are working towards it, right? So thank you for highlighting some of those challenges. I just wanted to touch the challenge of money, and to touch the fact that during that conversation that I've spoken about, that the consortium members were having on Women's Day, another recognition of a challenge that was made was on shrinking our civic space, which I know must be common for every woman lawyer, right, on this call that is organizing through either NGOs or social movements or groups or activism. I know that shrinking civic space is also one of those challenges that make it very difficult for communities to organize. But also the beauty, or the positive thing that comes out of that, is that when civic space reduces for NGOs and CBOs or more organized movements, then social movements become necessary, right? Because they are pushing back, they are led by the people, they are in the community. So it becomes important for us to invest in social movements. So thank you for highlighting some of those challenges that are experienced in our organizing in some of these movements that we have. I'd like to go to the second last question before we get into the comments or any questions that any of the people that may have on the call. Isabella, how do you see, or how important is it that that grassroots mobilization and community engagement in movement building for women's rights organizations is going on right now? What role do you see is a role local activists and organizations playing in driving change at that level, at the grassroots level? And this question really would like for you to also speak on some of the examples that you've seen, because I know that you have worked in some of the areas where some of these smaller social movements have begun, or smaller online movements have organized. I know that you're part of the organizing around West Nile and joining the social grid. Is it the social grid to have connection to electricity, for example, for the last 2 years? So for you, how do you see, why is grassroots mobilization important, and what is the role of local activists at that level?
Thank you very much, Kemi. And yes, it's been a struggle. West Nile is still not on the grid. And anyone who goes to West Nile knows that the trauma that happens when you're seated somewhere and electricity goes off at 8 and then 8 a.m. and someone tells you, no, it will come back at 6 p.m. and you have enough work on your table. And so that cursing led me to join the social movement to connect West Nile to the grid. But how important is grassroots mobilization? Very important, especially for legitimacy. The statement "nothing for us without us" would probably applies best in an instance of this nature, because when we look at when we look at most of the challenges that we are discussing today, when we look at gender-based violence, when we talk about negative cultural norms, negative social norms, yes, they affect all of us, but there is a certain privilege of knowledge for we who are on this platform, which privilege of knowledge might not be enjoyed by women at the grassroots. And so, if we are talking about gender equality, the extreme phases of gender equality would most likely be found at the periphery of society, which is usually at the grassroots. And so it is important that women at the grassroots are very much part of movement building. There are instances where our movement building has been described as elitist. And one of the explanations by a couple of women I have sat with has been that elite women have have a place and they have power and they have a certain agency and they have a certain privilege that they bring onto this movement building bus. That notwithstanding, elite women alone, civil society women alone cannot get this bus to its destination. The women who are most affected, the women who are most likely to be affected, must be part of this. And so when we say what are some of the women doing, I know that there's a woman that I met in Zombo recently, I think about a month ago. And her contribution to this, she's a woman in the church. Her contribution to our to the struggle towards gender equality is to just make sure that the women that she engages with in the church are pursuing marriage, and not this marriage of I stay with a man, therefore he's my husband, but pursuing legal marriage. And she's talking to them about getting married in the church or going to get married at the registrar. But she's saying you need to get married. Why? Because of the issues of land, in Zombo. And she's saying if they chase you off this land, there is a problem. And so grassroots efforts like that are very important, because they go a long way in strengthening the work and the efforts that we are doing. Also, when we look at when we look at the grassroots, there are women who are doing classes everywhere under trees, in the church, at the community hall, around women's agency. And efforts of that nature are still very important because between you and I, they are probably more believable than we who visit once in a while. And so to ensure that there is a connectivity between the work that we do and the realities on the ground, this is an important, it's important that grassroots are mobilizing. The other thing is that when grassroots mobilize themselves, when there is authentic mobilization, it does not cost too much money. Why? Because the resources that are being used are resources that can be found in the community. The community is not asking for transport refund because it stays in that community. They are not making abnormal demands um, for all manner of allowances because they are mobilizing themselves. And so for a lot of the challenges that we face as civil society, as we build movements, grassroots mobilization answers those questions because it's done by the people, for the people. And all we maybe do is either ally with them or come in to support in one way or the other. The other thing that grassroots or local activism does is that um, there's a word that I'm looking for. So maybe let me give a scenario. One of the things that a lot of, okay, not a lot, but some donors have been doing in the past, some development partners, is they've been asking for organizations to register their community groups. In a context like ours, when groups of that nature are registered at the grassroots, we there's an element of delegitimizing coming together or very organic movement building. Why? Because we know that in a context like ours in Uganda, the state thrives on any organized formations. Why? Because as soon as there is order, or as soon as there is a registration or there's a formalization or a formal relationship with the state, then it becomes the state's first way to clamp you down, either by taking away your certificate or by causing you to comply, comply. So the beauty of grassroots mobilization and community engagements is that they are not bound they're not bound by any formal state relationship. And so, for instances where we who are formal are gagged, grassroots community are the stopgap, because the state does not have a certificate to take. The state cannot force them to report to the NGO bureau. The state cannot force any of them, any of these things that they are forcing and gagging us with on grassroots and communities. And that is why I believe it's very important now more than ever, for us to for us to recognize and build that particular investment. Over to you, Kemi.
Thank you very much, Isabella. And for me, my last question on my end, or my second last question, really, is on how do we envision sustaining momentum, right, in those different organizings? And maybe before you respond, I just wanted to say that that's a conversation that we've had as an institution before, even in the different initiatives around organizing women in the informal sector. How do we organize women in the informal sector better to be able to leverage or to occupy a space where they have better protection of their rights, have decent work as an issue of concern for them, right? Without gagging, without then making it impossible for them to do their work. And this is an example that our team leader here at FIDA and the Secretariat usually speaks about. How do we, for example, support women's VSLAs or self-help groups or mothers' unions, depending on what name you give any of those savings groups that you're part of? How do we organize them? How do we recognize them? How do we make sure that no one is running away with the money that you're saving without guarding their organizing? Because we now know that in the women's self-help groups, it's not really only about saving and sharing out at the moment, that these groups have grown to a place where we could call them social movements that are supporting not just financial inclusion and literacy, but it's also supporting work around social reproductive health, but also sort of building and strengthening social structures that are important in the protection of rights of women and children in communities. So how do you, for you, envision sustaining momentum and building upon the several progress points that you've spoken about in advancing gender equality and equity in Uganda in the years to come? What are some of those strategies that you see that are necessary to ensure that those gains that we have made, the fact that we have so many women in parliament because of support of different social movements, the fact that we have so many women in social structures that are participating in leadership positions, that are in elective politics or in any other form of local government organizing? How do we sustain that momentum that we've made around sexual reproductive health of especially grassroots women? How do we sustain some of the momentum that we've made for women in northern Uganda that were involved in the conflict and have suffered sexual violence, whose impact they continue to face in this year? So how do we sustain that momentum that you've spoken about, and how do we support these groups better that are organizing?
Thank you very much, Kemi. Maybe let me start with the grassroots mobilization. I mean, the grassroots efforts and the community efforts. I think one of the ways that we can support grassroots efforts is to leave them. And I don't mean not work with them, but I'm saying meet them in the outfit and state that they are in. We should desist from turning them into little us, into little us, into turning them into little organizations of ours and making them, owning them. Because as soon as we start this thirst for ownership comes in, then we actually disorganize their efforts to exist. But coming to coming to respond broadly, it's to do continuous, really invest in the continuous work um, around one training. You know, what training does is that training builds knowledge, training builds skill, and once you leave someone with knowledge and skill, that is an investment and an effort that you cannot take away from them. The other thing that we could do is continuous policy advocacy. There are a lot of policies that in my apologies, someone is attempting to call me. I don't know that it's because it has just hit 8 o'clock. But when we look at continuous policy advocacy, it's to say that the work around progressive policy does not come to an end. Every day there's something that's changing. Right now, because of how we are organizing, a lot of work is moving onto the virtual spaces. So what does legislation look like in terms of protecting people on virtual spaces? What guidelines are in place when it comes to protecting people in virtual places? And that is something that we can continue to do. Provide pursue policy advocacy, pursue legislation that recognizes the context that we are in. The other thing that we can continue to do is, in the struggle for gender equality, especially for us who are in institutions, is to provide workplace equality. That is very important because the people that we work with are the people who go to the communities. We can't be talking about gender equality in communities if we cannot find gender equality in our institutions, if we can't find gender equality in the spaces that we lead and exist in. And so it's important to build inwards so that the outwork can be made legitimate. The other thing that is important as we push for gender equality is to recognize that the chains of oppression are very interlinked. And so we no longer have the luxury of saying we are just working for women. And so the conversation on intersectionality, which we have spoken ourselves hoarse on, comes back because it's not just women. It is that within the struggle for women's equality, what lenses are you putting on to ensure that women with disabilities are not left behind? What lenses are you putting on to ensure that we are that on the basis of ethnicity, we are not being found at fault? On the basis of sexuality, we are not being faulted. But also, you talked about some of the groups that are being established, and I love one statement that you made. They're no longer just savings groups. Yes, one of the ways that we sustain the work is by making things more than what they are. So how do you do that? We establish support systems, and support systems look like, if it's a savings group, what more support would they need to be able to thrive? If the support that they need is support around counseling, provide it. If they're in a community where, as people who save, there is an aspect of legal aid that is needed, let's provide that. And so within every community that is contributing towards this social movement, they are beyond the one thing that we look at them. Their lenses they manifest to us very differently. They are not just women who save, they are mothers, they are daughters, they are women with disability, they are women in the church. And so within that, there is a lot of support, but there's also a lot of unique realities for each of them. And if we attempted to understand them through those lenses, we would go a long way in building the movement. Over to you, Kemi.
Thank you so much, Isabella. I'd like to open up the chat and the conversation for about two questions. It's 7 minutes past 8. We should be closing at 8, but I think it's important that we hear from one or two people with comments or questions so that we can officially close about 3 minutes. But thank you so much, Isabella, for speaking on this, because I think it has become almost urgent for everybody to work with somebody, and there's no more authentic way to work than working with the most affected people to speak on issues that affect them. But also there's no better investment for me, I believe, like the investments on in women's movements, because we have seen the results, like I mentioned, through the support of the Dutch Foreign Affairs Ministry and SIHA Network. We've been able to invest in social movements in Pade, in Gulu, and in Kampala. And we have seen that this thing actually works, that it actually organizes women, that we are seeing results in terms of political participation of women, in terms of women enjoying public space and participating in economic activities. But it's also worrying that the State of Global Foundation grant making report of last year showed that only 3% of global funding actually went to grassroots organizing, which I think for me is a point for us to take seriously. Looking at what Isabella has said is important for these grassroots to survive, but also seeing the work that we have done in Pade, where a lot of rural women exist, seeing the work that we've done in Gulu, I think it's important that we are taking seriously the issue of investment in grassroots organizing, recognizing their work. And like Isabella, some of the things, some of the challenges that you have noted, and some of the techniques or tactics that you have mentioned that we can employ as NGOs, as feminist groups, as feminist coalitions, as women's rights organizations, what we can do to support grassroots organizations and individuals better, but also on supporting individuals in these social movements better to be able to fight back, to negotiate, to lobby, and all those things that we do with these groups. So, if there are no questions in the chat, I'll just take one or two comments. We have a minute to closure. If there's any question, any comment, any burning question or comment that we can take in a minute, we will do that
Can I give
before
you
we
my email?
close.
Yeah, yeah. Prefer to receive via email.
Any
Mm.
questions,
Is there
ladies
any
and
other way you could?
gentlemen? Any comments that I
I
could
have a
take
hard drive, but
before
I think
our
email
one
is
minute
I also have
lapses?
a hard drive.
what's I think email is better.
Or
What's because I've never bothered to put antivirus on my
antivirus.
laptop.
Okay.
So what's the email?
It's Andrew Trevor, but
One
Trevor.
name,
All
Yeah,
right.
Andrew
and
Trevor.
it's all lowercase.
Yeah,
Yes, Judith, are you? Okay. All right. If
Hmm?
there are no questions,
yeah.
if there are no comments,
Andrew
it means,
Trevor, but
Isabella, you've
Trevor
done a
without
great
or
job
with E
on
instead of
organizing our thoughts, on
at
re-energizing us in
gmail.com.
the work that we are doing. And we are grateful for the time and for everybody that has made it to this particular episode of the coffee series. The intention of this coffee series is to provoke thought,
Right now?
to provoke unlearning and learning,
Yeah.
but also for us to speak about some of these topical issues that affect our survival as women that are organizing either in the NGO or private organ or private practice, or really anyone that is concerned with the state of affairs right now. Thank you so much, Doreen Tisache. I see your comment in the chat. Esther Namboka, I've also seen your comments. So thank you very much. They're mostly saying thank you so much to you, Isabella and Fida, for convening us here for this session of the coffee series. It's 11 minutes past 8, and allow me sign out and say happy Friday. But thank you so much, Isabella, for coming today to speak to us on the importance of social movements, investment in them, but also why it's important to sustain them and what sustainability looks like to most of these social movements, to everybody that has kept waking up with us for this second season and this particular episode of the Coffee Series, which is a production of the Leadership Academy. Thank you so much and have a pleasant Friday.
Thank you very much, Kemi, and a pleasant Friday to you and everyone. Cheers.